Thanks for having me here. It's the first time I've actually diverted myself off the highway and ended up in Innisfail. I'm one of those people that does that fly-by wave all the time, actually about once a week. This is a fun topic. I spent, 30 years with the provincial government and 5 years with the feds before that. So you're right, I was 4 years old when I started working for government. And I spent all that time in water and at the conflict edge of water. I've survived this far. I don't have a personal psychiatrist yet. I'm thinking about getting one. Learned a lot about human nature, and I'm sure a lot of you do too when you run into the conflict side of things. There's a lot of you that are very well versed in the water issues. I know you from a number of committees and things, and I'm sure there's a number of you that are just getting your feet wet in this thing. So I'm going to do general concepts. I'm going to dive down into some detail, and then I'm going to come back up to general things and go back down again, so that you get an overall appreciation for what we're trying to work with here. To do a proper job of this would take 4 or 5 of our specific subject experts and probably a 2 or 3 day seminar to really cover the topic. So we're just sort of sliding over the top here to get you started in it. The topic, I just threw this out as a topic just to show you that, or to emphasize that talking about how much water we leave in the river is one of those impossible tasks. Everybody has a different opinion, everybody has different backgrounds to bring those opinions from, and there is no right answer. There is no right answer. It doesn't matter how deep you dig into the science, there is no right answer for today and for the future. It's more about a process and deciding on the process of how you within your social group will decide how to make changes from time to time in the future. The balancing act has to come between providing certainty, and certainty for the environment, certainty for the economy, at the same time providing flexibility for those same elements to adapt to differing social pressures as they come and go. It's easy to make a decision when you know what the cost of bread is today if you assume it will always be the same. But people who get hungry change their minds about what social decisions they want to make about flows in rivers. And seeing as I've been working in government for 100 years, I've seen many of those changes. I've been the bad guy who issued all those licenses that created the so-called over-allocation, because that's what was demanded at the time, was to get the water out of the river and make an economy with it and pay for healthcare. And we changed our minds, looked backwards and said, oh look, we over-allocated. We didn't over-allocate it, we allocated to the level that everyone wanted at the time, and then we changed our minds. So now we're looking at it as a process for how do we adapt to changing minds, and how do we go forward with that. So we'll get started if I can get all the buttons right here. You know this basin. You know where the Red Deer Basin is, so I'm not gonna have to point that part out. But you're part of a larger basin, the South Sask Basin as a whole. Now it's certainly true that down here, the critical part is the Oldman and the Bow join form the South Sask, and they enter Saskatchewan. 2 miles inside Saskatchewan, the Red Deer joins them. It was part of the 69 arrangement that Alberta's share would be apportioned below where the Red Deer joins inside Saskatchewan. So that sort of created these two guys, and then there's this basin up here called the Red Deer. But they are much more joined than that. It is possible, and this is the opposite of what most people think, it's possible for water from the Oldman Basin to get into the Red Deer Basin, and it happens on a regular basis. Up here in a place called Willow Creek, there's a reservoir called Chain Lakes that straddles the boundary between the Oldman and the Bow. We take Oldman Basin water, we drop it into that reservoir, it goes into Stimson Creek, into Pekisco, into the Highwood, and into the Bow, It runs down the Bow and ends up in the Eastern Irrigation District, which releases water into the Red Deer. There is Old Man water in the Red Deer. The Bow Basin is the greatest losing basin. Don't tell Calgary I said this, but they're all losers. They lose more water to other basins than anyone else. There's a diversion down here that returns the Bow River Irrigation District returns water into the Old Man. The Western Irrigation District, the majority of the Western Irrigation District is actually in the Red Deer Basin. The same with the Eastern Irrigation District down here. See where the basin's really close to the river? That's where the Western District diversion comes out. Irrigates this area, and the Eastern Irrigation District irrigates this area. The two of them together return over 100,000 acre feet a year on average to the Red Deer River. That extra 100,000 makes things look a lot better down here than they otherwise would be. That's a reality. The only time the Red Deer Basin loses is a small diversion up here to Lacombe, but it's very small in scale. So when we look at in-stream flows in the Red Deer, the activities in the upper Red Deer would have a much larger influence on the lower Red Deer if it wasn't for all that return flow moving across into the Red Deer River. Simple facts, the city of Brooks, which gets all its water from the Bow River, is in the Red Deer Basin. So that's generally how things move around in there, and I say that just to point out it's complicated, and a lot of the details are not well understood by most people, certainly not by the media, and not well understood by people on the ground. So when you get into the details and get past the emotional part, things change a little bit. Okay. Water conservation objectives. It's a new term. It's in the Water Act. It's a legal term, and the intention is to define or find some sort of balance between protecting the environment, riparian environment in stream, and how much water we take out. We know obviously this has to deal with social issues as well as economic and ecological factors. Depending on what group I go to, I might change the order of those things. The order really doesn't matter. They're all interdependent. You can't have one with the other. Frankly, an ecological factor is often an economic one. Waste assimilation in a river is an ecological function, but it provides a very valuable service to municipalities for wastewater treatment. So those things are very intertwined. We spent a lot of time in the past talking about how much water should be allocated, and that usually has become the primary discussion. How much water should we use? Therefore, everything else is left over and stays in the river. Discussing water conservation objectives takes it from the other end and says, how much should we leave in the river? And you know what happens next. Therefore, how much is available for allocation? So it's the same discussion, but just taking it from the other direction. Most of this is about quantity. We really can't divorce quantity from quality, so we got to keep quality in mind as well while we're going through this. Water conservation objectives can be managed in any number of different ways. In some areas, they've just confirmed the status quo. They said, we're not going to change anything, but we're going to protect the flow in the stream at this level. So really haven't changed anything except said things aren't going to change. In some places where restoration is of interest or improving the in-stream flow, a WCO can actually be a target. It can be higher than what's there now and work up to it. Some basins are struggling with this, the Milk River in particular, because in the summertime, the flow in the Milk River in the summertime is about 200% of natural. It's way above, because the U.S. diverts a substantial portion of the St. Mary River and puts it into the Milk River. So the Milk River in the summer, 30 CFS is the normal flow. There's usually 660 in there. So how do you establish, it's not just 100% of the natural flow. The status quo is far higher than that, so they've got a very different issue to work with. In the past, we used terms like minimum flows. You can only take water if this much is left. And we started in the in the 70s was something called the Montana method, and it came up with a single number, and it was based on, it's a desktop historical numbers, and it was no less than 50% of the long-term mean. And then it would come up with a number because it was the annual record that was used. So you'd get a small stream that would have, for example, 17 cubic feet per second is the minimum flow. Well, in the winter time, the highest flow they'd ever get was 5. So by saying 17 is the minimum flow, you automatically created a situation where you could take no water in the summertime, and yet, or sorry, in the wintertime, and yet that wasn't part of the decision-making process. So now that we use variable flows, so that they're set for not only week by week in the year, and we can divide by 7 and make it daily if you want, but it's really not accurate down to that level. Week by week, and it's a percentage of what the natural flow would be on that day. The only way to figure out what the flow would be naturally on that day is to put all the diversions back into the recorded flows, calculate that. It's called a naturalized flow, and it's a percentage of that. So it gets a little bit technical. Some of the ways that we've managed water conservation objectives, and we used to call them other names, so I'll get into that later. If you're not getting the flows you want now, you can build storage, take the water from the spring freshet and then move it into the low flow periods. Not change anything about allocation or who uses what when, build storage and run water over top of the situation. That was normal procedure in the Old Man Basin. There were a number of reservoirs built to do that. As the economy was developed and more water was used and the river flows went down to the point where municipalities had difficulties, we built another storage, ran water over top of it, developed that, built another storage, repeated the process. The reason we're having some of the discussions about water allocation now is the good storage sites are gone and there's not that much more water to store in them if we did. WCOs can be implemented with something like a cutoff condition on a license. The minimum flows on oil sands projects on the Athabasca are done this way. They are minimum flow conditions applied to licenses. Rather than a target for the stream, they're conditions on licenses. WCOs in basins which have not yet run into a lot of problems can be set as current targets, which then set the precedent for how much allocation could be given out between now and in the future. So although some basins have looked at this and said we don't need to figure that out now, we don't have to have that hard community discussion now because we've got lots of water, there aren't any shortages, all they're doing is deferring this discussion to the time when they're all in conflict, and they would rather have the discussion when they're in conflict rather than today. It's a hard conversation to start, but better done now than later when you're having those conflicts. The unique thing about these water conservation objective, this terminology, and putting it in the Act the way we did, is that it can actually hold an allocation or a license with a priority number and then be defended against other water users who also have licenses. The concept in its purest form, if you had a basin with no use, nice fresh basin, and you're going to start off with saying how much we're going to allocate, how much we're going to keep in the system. If you decided you wanted to leave 75% of the flow in the stream, you could allocate that through a license, give it a priority number, and then issue allocations after that with junior numbers. Therefore, the in-stream flow would always be the senior right and would always be protected. There are no streams like that in the province, although the Peace River is pretty close. So what we find ourselves doing now is using methodology to try and backtrack a little bit to rebuild these things. But the advantage of being able to license in-stream water with a priority number means that we can use transfers and other mechanisms to voluntarily move water back into that system and protect it. So you've heard about the transfer system that is being used currently in the Bow and the Old Man to manage the risk for new water users, and actually to acquire supplies for new water users. The transfer holdbacks, we can hold back up to 10% of those licenses during the time of transfer. Priority number stays with that piece that's transferred. So for example, when Rocky View acquired a chunk of water from the Western Irrigation District by paying for their canal lining to free up the water that was being wasted, and that water was transferred to Rocky View for various purposes, we took back 10% to leave in the Bow River with a 1903 priority. So we now have a chunk of water in the Bow River that has a very senior right and will be protected all the time. There are various mechanisms for transferring parts of active licenses. We have some people voluntarily offering to return some water. We've got some guys who irrigated all their life and they found out their kids aren't coming back from school because they found another job somewhere. They're tired of using the water for irrigation and they would just like to turn it back to the system, but they don't want to just cancel their license, leave the water in the system and have someone else use it. They want to make sure that if they give it up, it's protected. We've had oil and gas companies, the same thing. They said we'd be glad to give it up back to the river, but we don't. If we give it up and it goes back in the system and our competitors end up using it for their risk management, we don't want to do that. So by putting it in one of these WCO licenses, we can protect it from other use and use those priorities as well for risk managing the in-stream flows. The last line I probably shouldn't use just before an election, anything about directives and buybacks and things like that. So there has not been any talk about that, although some have suggested that we should just take 2 or 3% from every license and put it into a WCO license for protection or some other tool such as that. But of course that would have to be by consensus with the existing water users. Remember at the outset I said it's about certainty as much as it's about flexibility. Certainty is what makes jobs work and taxes work, and that's where we get the money to pay my salary as well as health care and other things. We need some certainty in the system, not just we're going to pluck it from here and there and everywhere. So that's part of that system. Some people look at these WCOs as it's one number throughout the whole basin. It doesn't have to be. Just so happens that we have upstream reaches that are generally in national parks. Guess what? 100% of the natural flow remains in the stream. So up there, we can have a WCO of 100%, no problem. There's no issue with that. Mid-river reaches, mid-river in these basins is all a little bit different. In the Bow, we've got a great big city way up on a tributary, in effect. You might not be aware that the South Saskatchewan River is a larger flow stream than the North Saskatchewan. But you've all been to Edmonton and seen the size of the stream running through there. That's because Edmonton on the North Sask is below all the tributaries for that basin. Calgary, however, is way up on one branch of 1/3. So it's a large city with very little water moving through it. So they're very different situations. The lower reaches are more difficult. I got a couple of graphs I'll show you as to the concerns about the lower reaches. Usually by the time we get into the lower reaches of a river, lots of stuff has happened. The flow is lower. But also, it's warmer and it's naturally warmer. So some of the needs for maintaining fisheries, etc., are less in warm flowing streams than they are in the upper tributaries, which are generally the spawning stream and need colder water. So it works a little bit in our favor for consumption that way as well. I should have started with terminology just so that I knew that you were all on the same page I am, but I figured if I started with some government guy shows up, starts with terminology, you'd probably all run. So it's a little late, but here it is. Natural flow, naturally occurring. Watch the natural flow thing. There is no natural flow in Alberta for the most part, outside of the national parks. There just isn't. Everything has been modified in some way. Naturalized flow is a flow record that we've put the diversions back into it in order to recreate, or at least create a data record of what the natural flow would have been if no one had messed with it. Generally, that's the number that's used for apportionment. Apportioning with Saskatchewan is based on more or less 50%. So in order to determine how much we owe Saskatchewan at any given time, we have to naturalize the flows by putting diversions back in, decide what the natural flow should have been, and then work the percentages back from them. For the most part, it's close to 50%, but not always, and that's a whole nother presentation. In-stream flow needs is something that we used, we thought was a fancy new invention that would solve everything in the 1990s. That's the science. It's the science of how much flow is needed in a stream to continue the natural functions that existed before we started messing around with things 100 years or so ago. It's not all of the natural flow, it's the amount we would need to continue those functions. It generally turns out to be about 85% of what the natural flow would be. It's not perfect, but it'll take you down to a level where in a really dry year, fisheries might be strained somewhat, but will be able to recover in a following year. IFN is a very important piece in here because it's the science part. There's no social in it. There's no economics in it. It's the science part. We need to have this separated out so that the scientists are not subjected to the social discussions and the economic discussions, so that we can figure out what a stream needs first and then talk about how we might want to modify it. In some basins, they've mixed the two, and what you find there is you find people who want to take water out of the system arguing that we should protect this fish instead of that fish because it's more special, where in fact they know that that fish needs a lot less water than the other one, so they adjust their social values to try and get the outcome that they want. The only way to manage that is to do the IFN first as science, then do the social discussion based on that. Minimum flow. Minimum flow is old terminology. It's 1970 stuff, and I talked about the single number, that basic amount. It's not suitable for some of the complexities that we've got now. In-stream objective, those are calculations we did in the 90s, which took the IFN and suggested that if we ran a desktop analysis, we could come up with hundreds of different numbers of minimum flows to operate reservoirs with. I used to issue licenses that would have about 12 pages appended to the license, and you'd have to look down the chart to see if the flow is this today, then you can only take this much depending on. Very complex. But they are embedded in a lot of our reservoir operating plans right now, so we have to know what those numbers are. And as we talked about, the WCO is the newest invention. There'll be somebody up here about 10 years from now telling you how old that WCO thing is and that there's some new terminology we have to do. The concept in WCO, it can be anchored in the statute, so it's stronger than any of the others. There has to be public input before it can be created, and it can be licensed so that it has a priority number as well. You've likely seen this. This is water flows in all of the South Sask Basin. This is the chart that we probably used the most in doing the South Sask Basin plan to make an impression on folks that aren't very involved in water as to what our situation currently is. This chart can be taken apart 100 different ways, but generally it starts in the 1890s and runs to, I think we got 2009 on that one now. These bars are all annual flows, and you've seen from Jennifer's presentation just how variable they can be. They're actually more variable than this because a roll-up of 3 rivers. Any one river can be much more extreme than this at any one time. And these are the sum of all of the allocations over time. This right here, that's 1903. That's the water that was allocated to the western, what is now the western and eastern irrigation districts. It's actually allocated to the CPR to compensate them for the federal government having given them a whole bunch of dry land that wasn't worth anything, in their view, because they couldn't sell it. So that's the 1903 allocation there. This is the 1950 allocation for the St. Mary's project, when the Waterton Bellions together to create the St. Mary project, and there's about 700,000 acres depending on that. So you can see the increases. You can see these were big projects. Starting here, there's lots of smaller projects, and that's why it climbs on a more gradual slope. This jump in here is the 1991 regulation, and you can see it's flat after we decided to cap the basin. The two colors in there, the green is the Saskatchewan entitlement, and the blue is the Alberta entitlement. We used to put them all in one bar, and they were way up here, and everything looked good, until you realized that Saskatchewan was supposed to get some of it too. So these blue bars are Alberta's entitlement, and you can see what's starting to happen down in this end. My good friends in the north often point to it and they say, you guys are crazy, look what you've done. But they forget that we've got this little bar over here. That light blue bar, that's the sum of all of the storage that's available to mitigate dry periods in that basin. So if you were to take that blue bar and stack it on top of any one of these shortages, you can see why we don't have problems from year to year. Unless that's not full at the beginning of the year, if you had a previous dry year. The 99 to 2001 drought in the southern part of this basin, that actually occurred by the spring of 2001. Most of this storage.
Sorry, just trying to let that out.
Most of this storage was empty, and that's why the guys on the southern trips were 40% short that year. And that's why they entered into the sharing arrangement to make sure municipalities had enough water to continue through that year. So some people think the answer is to make this bar bigger, and some think it's to bring this one down. And I'll leave that for you to decide. Just a little piece of fun you can have with this one. Most people that are making decisions now were born somewhere in here. If you look at this chunk of flows in here, there aren't any of these really deep shortages. There was about 25 years there without any real shortages. And this is what a lot of people think is normal. Whereas in fact, the 80s, the 2001, 2002, the 30s are actually quite normal to have in our system, and we need to be prepared for those. Jennifer talked a little bit about how much water is allocated in various places. Again, you see these extraordinary numbers like 118% on the St. Mary. Some of the scientists like to quote those. There's also about 600,000 acre-feet of storage in there as well. So although it's 118% of the median, there's almost a full median's worth of storage in place at any one time. And these three are part of that 70% in the old man. The point of this is to show you that the Red Deer is in a very different position than what those basins are at right now. That means there's opportunity to make some decisions about how you want to allocate water in the future. I really don't like pie charts, but I'm going to try this one anyway. The Old Man River and the Bow River, the great big pieces here, those are Jennifer's problem. Those are irrigation. And you can see over here, the Red Deer folks, you're a very equal kind of equitable type society. You've spread your diversions around amongst all those different purposes fairly equally. What that means is you don't have most of your water use concentrated in one peak area. It's more spread out over the year. Makes it a little bit easier to manage. So that makes for a little different situation than the others. Remember that IFN thing we talked about, the in-stream flow needs. How much does a stream really need? This is what the experts will put together to explain it. If we look at flow, you can see this is just typical of a normal river hydrograph and a prairie stream. this much water is needed to maintain water quality throughout the year, just basic water quality. You would have to add this much water to make the fish happy, because they need more than just basic water quality, and some of these flows actually initiate spawning and things like that. If you have a flat flow, no temperature changes, they don't get it in their heads they're supposed to spawn, so they're happy, but they don't make kids. I'm not making any analogies about that. This chunk of water is for riparian vegetation. Riparian vegetation, the way it is developed based on these kinds of hydrographs, so it needs to be scoured and washed in the spring, and it needs a good flood to soak roots deep so that it can last well into the fall season. And this piece up here is channel maintenance. Channel maintenance is another word for flood. It's the polite word you use when you're after you've had a flood and you want to talk about these things and everybody wants to get rid of the floods. Channel maintenance is also necessary. If we don't have scouring at some time in a stream's life, then we don't get the silt off the bottom, we don't expose the substrate, we don't get the gravel, then the fish don't lay eggs properly, and all kinds of other things happen. So even if we were to meet what the fish need, the fish actually need part of that as well to create normal channel processes. When those channel processes get a little out of hand, then Earl Graham gets excited and he doesn't want to hear about channel maintenance. Those are the elements of the natural system that we need to consider when we're looking at how much stays in the stream. Decisions we've already made, because we're not starting from zero here. We've already made decisions, and we have to go from those decisions forward. On the Bow and the Old Man, we've decided that we've reached the limit for taking additional water out of the stream. There's a Crown reservation in place saying what additional water can come out and what can't, and the WCO has been established there. The Red Deer sub-basin, the decision was that target allocation of another 600,000 acre-feet could be taken, cubic decameters, could be taken out of the basin, but there should be a temporary closure at 550,000 to see if the numbers are still accurate. What that decision does is it permits economic development to continue. It recognizes that there will be impacts on the aquatic environment. It's not the IFN number, it's less than that. That number was set at the greater of either 45% of natural flow on any day in which you measure it, or 16 cubic meters per second below Dixon Dam, or 10 cubic meters per second below the Blind Man River in that lower reach that has a lot of return flow from the Bow in it. Those were the targets that were set. So how do we pick these kinds of targets? And if we want to change these targets, what kind of information do we need to have? I badgered a bunch of the science guys and they said, you can't just keep telling us that IFN and natural flow is the only thing we're ever going to have, because people want to make decisions. And they might agree with you, but they want to know what the effect of taking more water out is. Because if we take out twice as much water and we get 3 times the economy and we lose 4 fish, maybe that's something we want to do. On the other hand, if we take that much water out and we only get 20% more economy and we wipe out all of the fishery, that's a whole nother decision, and we need to make our choices in the middle. So people have an infatuation with the green, yellow, red thing. It's probably because we're all drivers or something and it means something. So generally, the green in these bars represents good to go, slight impact. And the red suggests that maybe we should stop something and take another look. So on the Red Deer River, the concept was natural flow would sit up in here. The present use has got you somewhere in the slight category. If we used in-stream flow need as the minimum, it would bring the aquatic environment down into that region somewhere. If the existing licenses were fully utilized, as well as the return flow, that would bring you down into here somewhere. If we had all those new licenses, those 660,000, and use a high in-stream flow number, it's down in here. The 45% you've got brings you down in there. So that's generally where the decisions have brought us to, or would take us to in the future. And these, you're not supposed to read that, don't worry about it. I mean, you can if you want, you don't have to squint. Those numbers come from places like this, where all the different uses of the river are down the one side, and we've got water quality and fisheries and riparian, remember that curve thing, all down one side, and then different possibilities across the top. And this gives us a matrix to decide what the effects are in between. The interesting part of this, you can see on water quality is still green under this water use scenario, but fisheries turns red. So somewhere in here we get things fine and things injured, and you need to make some difficult decisions in there. We know what the answer is here, we know what the answer is there. This is the difficult part. We have to make sure that we understand what's being affected and what not. So that's part of the information that can lead up to making these decisions. And then they're often made on reach by reach basis, because not every reach is the same. In this case, this was the bar that was set up for the Red Deer Reach 2, which is by Dinosaur Provincial Park. The current condition is right about here. And for comparison, the upper Waterton River would be like this, the upper belly here. Lower Waterton is currently down there, and lower St. Mary. So if you were to go and visit the lower Waterton and you thought that was the kind of river you'd like to see the red deer, then you could compare that and say we can go down to here, and maybe scenario 6 is even better than what we want. But if you go and visit the upper belly and you decide that's not something that you want to see the red deer, then you know you've got to stay above that and somewhere in the current condition. That was intended to help people just get a sense of what the changes were like as they were trying to make decisions. So these are some of the tools that are possible to use to work through that. How are we doing for time? Everybody's hungry now, right? I'm just going to go through a couple of graphs really quick, again, just to give you an idea where things are at. Upper Red Deer River Basin, so in the burnt timber area. There's your flow hydrograph. The dark blue is in the upper 25% of the time. This green is the lower 25% of the time. This is the other 50% in between. Basin demands in that area are down around in here, so they can always be met in the upper portion of the stream. Middle Red Deer, in the city Red Deer area, flow's getting pretty big. And you can see this dark line here. This is what your current WCO is. Your current objective is this black line. And at times that black line is higher than the highest flows. And it's that way because of releases from Dixon. So releases, that's that 16 CMS. The releases there are as high as the highest expected natural flows would ever be. That's a significant supplement to the basin. And in the summer period, the requirements are still below the lowest flow, so that they're always being met. You can see at the other end here as well. If you change the operation of Dixon Dam to put more water into this part, you would lose some at that end. To do that, you would have to deal with the water quality issue that this was set up in order to manage. You change the water quality, you don't need this water anymore, you can move it over to here. That just gives you an idea of some of the choices that can be made. And then the lower Red Deer near the mouth, you see the effect as well, continuing through here from the Dixon releases. These are the current demands, and that's the lowest flow you would ever expect. So you're still in pretty good shape down there. Just to give you an idea why the other basins did what they did, this is the Bow River Basin near Calgary, and this has the demand lines on it, and they're right flat down here at the bottom end. I also changed the scale on you. The upper scale on the other one was in here somewhere. So I rivers are different sizes. So you can see they've got no problem in terms of water use on the upper part of the bow, but when you get to the lower part of the bow, you can see what happens in here. This is a dry year demand, and that's a wet year demand. So obviously in the wet year you don't need as much, and you've got this supply with that demand. In the dry year you have this demand, and that's your supply as well. So you can see in the Red Deer it never came above here, whereas the bow, it's up in there somewhere. And same sort of situation with the upper Oldman. You can see demand is flat across the bottom, and you can see the dry year demand is way up here into the upper 25% of supply area, and yet that's the demand we would have when the flow was down in here. So you can see why they're doing what they're doing on that basin in terms of managing flows. Something else that we hear a lot, you might have read this one in the Canadian Geographic. I confronted this fellow. Actually, I did this to him. He was in a presentation. I knew he was going to be there, so I put this up and said, "What idiot said this?" It was really good entertainment. But I figured he deserved it, because you wouldn't believe how many phone calls I got about why you dirty guys down there are stealing all the Red Deer water. It's not true. It just isn't. Less than 50% of the Red Deer would be needed to make up the 50% apportionment to Saskatchewan. This complicated chart is intended to prove it, but if you just look in here, this line right here, this is 1987 to 2009. This blue line is how much we owe Saskatchewan. The green line is how much the Oldman and Bow produce in those years. And you can see in these years, those two rivers alone are more than meeting the requirement for Saskatchewan, and they need no water at all from the Red Deer. They can cover the Red Deer share, no problem. The only time there's a pinch, there was a pinch in 1988, and there was one in 2001. In this case, the Bow and the Oldman could not make the 50%, and by using 50% of the Red Deer, we covered it. But then it's supposed to be a 50% share anyway, and the Red Deer would be expected to produce 50% as much as any of the others. So, and I remember making that decision. We actually took about 2 weeks worth of water out of Dixon, because we thought we might be short and didn't need it. And the same thing here, I believe it was from October 3rd to October 19. We started the Dixon release a little early just in case we needed to cover it, but didn't need it. And those are the only two occasions where we even got close. And in those cases, it was only 50% of the Red Deer that was being used anyway. So there's a lot of, the reason I put this up is there's a lot of information out there, and a lot of it is suspect. If it sounds like somebody's really out of control and doing nasty things, chances are that there's an explanation behind it somewhere. And to really make these decisions properly, we need to get past some of those stories and get down to the facts. And then it gets even harder. Future directions is just a summary slide. Adaptive management is what it's going to take to manage our way through the future. Many different tools for doing that. We have to know those tools and make use of them as a group, collectively. Filling knowledge gaps is always important. The value of water is becoming a topic that's discussed a lot. There is a value to water, as much as people don't want to talk about value to water. There is. Up until the Water Act, a lot of that value of water was under the table. And lots of people did things with moving land around and buying and selling businesses in certain places because they couldn't move the water to the most efficient place. So they moved their business to a less efficient place to take advantage of the water. It was all happening under the table. What this act has done is brought it above the table so